Um, as, as Serena mentioned, I've had the great opportunity to provide resources and develop training sessions for our internal team on various topics related to the DEI space. And I'm looking forward to revisiting some of those topics with you all and hopefully bringing some new information your way regarding inclusive hiring practices, diversity recruitment, diversifying your pipeline, and otherwise. One thing to note as we get started, so later on, we're going to do a short little activity together. And I think it would be easier to complete with pen and paper. You can totally do it as a thought exercise in your head, but if pen and paper are accessible to you, feel free to go ahead and grab those in these first couple of minutes. Oh, sorry about that. So yeah, before we dive into the specific topics, I think it's important to kind of go back to the basics and remind ourselves, what DEI really means. So we know these terms, we've heard them so many times from our colleagues and candidates, clients. You see these buzzwords all over LinkedIn. And sometimes you even see them in different orders. It's just D&I, some add belonging and make it DIB. And while I find the existence of these different acronyms to kind of be reflective of society's evolving understanding of these issues, often these buzzwords and definitions associated can kind of feel just like that, words on a page. So I want to take a moment to do a slightly deeper dive on each one, as I believe, one factor that helps encourage change to accelerate is if we build a common language and understanding of these terms that leads these critical conversations. So first up, you see here, we have diversity. So as everyone knows, diversity broadly refers to anything that sets one individual apart from another. And it includes the full spectrum of human demographic differences. So race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, disability status, geographic location, and so on and so on. And it also includes different ideas, backgrounds, and opinions that people bring to the table. A little bit deeper than that, and I think in the context of diversity in hiring, it takes on a bit more of a specific meaning in that diversity is a relational concept. So it shows up in the composition of teams and organizations, and it's measured based on a collective whole. So in that sense, a person is not diverse, and there's no such thing as a diverse candidate. Referring to someone as diverse would only make sense if we're all the same, and that's the whole point. We're not. And I think this comes up a lot and is said a lot, and it's often well-intentioned. But for example, when we say that someone who is transgender is diverse, we implicitly imply that then a cisgender person or someone who identifies with their sex assigned at birth is the default or the norm. And so in this case, we can kind of unintentionally uphold cissexism and heteronormativity by reinforcing dominant identities as normal and accepted. And we don't want to do that. So to sum it up, while diversity is all about differences amongst people themselves are not diverse, we're individuals. And instead, diversity is relational. It's about the differences between people within your teams, your company, the greater community, and so on. And so next up, I'm actually going to skip over equity real quick and dive on into inclusion. I'm sure folks can see why the acronym isn't usually put in that order, but it does make the most sense to talk about inclusion next, because that's all about the work you do to ensure you're engaging with diversity. So I've seen the example used a lot that diversity is an invitation to a party, whereas inclusion is being asked to dance. And while I like it for its straightforward explanation, I really think being asked to do something does not necessarily equal inclusion, and that inclusion is really more about value. So it's all about leveraging that wealth of knowledge and insights and those different perspectives in this open, trusting, and diverse environment so that everyone involved feels valued and respected. So for example, a diverse workplace would acknowledge that they may have people on their teams who practice their religion or spirituality during the day. Inclusion would mean creating a space for those people to pray or meditate or observe in the workplace. And it shows that they're valued, encourages them to bring more of themselves to the workplace. So now, as for equity, oftentimes people use the terms equality and equity interchangeably because there is kind of a misconception that the terms have the same meaning. However, they don't have the same meaning and can't be used interchangeably, even though they do sound similar. So since we were just using a metaphor to talk about inclusion, a suitable one here is that equality ensures that everyone has a pair of shoes, but equity ensures that everyone has a pair of shoes that fit. So when we treat everyone equally, we treat everyone the same. But when we treat everyone equitably, we focus on their individualistic needs. People from marginalized groups often have way more barriers to overcome when accessing resources and opportunities than those from dominant or more privileged groups that they don't have to go through. So in a diverse organization, an equitable approach identifies those barriers and inequities and helps to elevate the people on the margins to an equal playing field. So I like using this graphic. I think it's a great kind of visual representation depicting the difference between equality and equity. But then it also expands to include reality and showing how kind of inequitable our current systems are, and then that need to move to liberation and truly remove the fence of oppressive systems altogether. Well, of course, both metaphors, cultural context and systemic barriers that marginalized people are subjected to are not considered. And of course, these concepts are a lot bigger than having shoes that fit or breaking down a fence. I still think this imagery helps, explain it regardless. Great. So now that we have our definitions in check and everyone has a lot of metaphors floating around in their head, how does this all apply to inclusive hiring? Well, one of the major areas of focus for DEI is related to recruitment, revolves around bias and unconscious bias. So we're going to kick things off there. And then we're going to move into some myths and facts regarding diversity recruitment that are really necessary to understand to ensure inclusive hiring practices. And then I will be able to provide some tips on diversifying your pipeline, talk a little more about the role of intent and how practicing allyship also contributes to inclusive hiring. Great. So first up on the docket, we have unconscious bias 101. More definitions. So feel free to read through those there. But biases are developed over the course of a lifetime. So it begins at a very early age through exposure to direct and indirect messages all around us. So think like media, punishment and rewards, education, peers, your family. And these learned associations cause us to have feelings and attitudes about other people that are based on characteristics such as race, ethnicity, age, gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, and so on. Breaking that down further into unconscious bias, as you see here, is a specific kind of bias that leads to quick and often inaccurate judgments. And so these judgments can give individual and groups both under advantages and under disadvantages. But these attitudes and beliefs are involuntary. So they're without individual awareness or intentional control. I think it's important to note that we all have biases. No one is exempt from having them. Naturally, our brains categorize things. And so it makes sense that we would do that with the people we interact with. I think there's also an assumption sometimes that only people in power can have biases, when in fact, people from all walks of life and all sorts of backgrounds can also show bias in favor or against certain groups. If you're ever interested in kind of reflecting on your own biases, I highly suggest checking out Harvard's Project Implicit Association test. It is a short online test that goes through a lot of different kind of different identities and shows your own implicit bias. And it's just a great tool to provide some self-reflection. So definitely take the chance to Google that after we wrap up if you haven't participated in that before. So if bias and unconscious bias are so innate, why is it a problem? In our everyday lives, when people don't fit our internalized expectations, we can sometimes have a lot of difficulty seeing their talents and motivations and potential clearly, which just leads us to have less than effective interactions. So for example, as recruiters at Clarity, it is our job to identify talent. So anything that can get in our way of seeing candidates clearly is a hindrance to doing our jobs the best we can. But when we understand how biases influence our behavior, we can take action to mitigate any negative response and help contribute to an inclusive culture instead. So one where everyone can contribute and innovate and provide solutions. Um, I think understanding identities can seem confusing when we hear people say things like, but we're all human, right? Or but however, identities are more complex and nuanced. So by saying we're all human, the unjust and often violent plights marginalized persons have experienced are completely ignored. By upholding a shared understanding that we all have our unique experiences, we also have the ability to relate and learn from others. So as this session is on inclusive hiring, I definitely lean heavily on the candidate side here, but all of this also plays out with internal teams too. So you'll see listed here on this slide a couple, I guess, like the top 4 types of unconscious bias that are kind of most often seen in hiring. Very important, and I think it's good to note that there are so many different types of bias. The list is really endless. So while these show up maybe more frequently than others, a couple of others to note are nonverbal bias. So that's when you maybe judge a candidate's ability to do the job based on a superficial trait. So something like tattoos or body weight. It's taking a one-dimensional characteristic instead of a full analysis to see if they are qualified. So if you think that CEOs should be tall, then you might discount anyone shorter than that assumed cutoff. Another one is expectation anchoring. So that's when you're convinced that maybe an earlier candidate was the best fit for the job. So you can stop taking into consideration any of the later candidates, even while you're still conducting those interviews. And then another one is contrast effect. So that happens when you might be seeing a lot of resumes all at once, or you're having interviews back to back for the same role. And you start to compare how those candidates are doing to the previous candidates instead of comparing individual skills and experiences to the job requirements only. So you might be thinking, what can we do about this? So luckily, there are a lot of great tools that we can all harness to help avoid allowing our unconscious bias to interfere with our decision making. And it really all starts with actively adjusting your mindset. So what does that mean? I think top of the list is to be humble. Understand that we are all vulnerable to these biases. It actually, research shows that if you think you are uniquely objective and fair, you're actually more likely to discriminate. So the paradox here is that the only way to be fair is to assume that you're not. Another way to adjust your mindset is to really slow down, monitor your thoughts and behaviors. Biases are really just mental shortcuts, and they're most likely to throw us off when we're tired or rushing, distracted, and in a highly emotional state. So just by slowing down and pausing, reflecting, it can really go a long way, even though it might seem small. Another, actionable step is to actively individualize instead of generalize. So think of, each candidate you encounter or each teammate you encounter as an individual, and don't make any other assumptions. I try and catch myself anytime I say the words I assume, or I'm assuming that they, and I stop and say, why am I making this assumption? Why am I assuming that? Take a step back. Next, you can do perspective taking. So putting yourself into the position of that person. Research shows that those who imagined themselves as a minority or the stereotyped group were assessed as having less bias and higher levels of empathy. So at the end of the day, probably the biggest piece is being internally motivated to be fair and square. It can't be because you're afraid of external consequences, but instead it really has to be internally motivated to do the right thing. So outside of adjusting your mindset, another actionable step is to focus on de-biasing. So this is basically attempting to kind of scrub our brains of implicit biases. So as we mentioned before, biases come from what we see every day in pop culture and media. And so while it's very difficult to change that landscape all by ourselves, our biases are malleable. And if we receive sufficient counter messaging, we can begin to remold our implicit attitudes. And one way to do that is through counter stereotype training. So what that means is providing yourself meaningful exposure to counter-typical examples. So watching content that highlights female scientists or Latinx doctors, Asian novelists, the list goes on and on. I mean, hopefully we encounter these examples in our daily lives already, right? Living in inclusive communities. Let's say, for example, you work at a place like Clarity Recruiting, a woman-owned and operated business and primarily female leadership. You're probably more likely to decrease your implicit stereotype that links leadership to men over women. Another way to kind of take an actionable step towards this is adjusting your media diet. I talked about this a little bit, but since unconscious bias is built on stereotypes, you'll build more of these stereotypes if you're only reading and viewing and listening to one point of view. So you can really check yourself with questions, what TV shows am I watching? What podcasts do I listen to? Who are the author of the last 3 books I read? Even something as small as like, what's on my phone screensaver? Just kind of constantly asking yourself those questions and seeing how you can adjust can make a really big impact. And another thing to do is stereotype replacement. So just going through the step-by-step process of identifying when your thinking is led by a stereotype, label it as stereotypical, reflect on why it occurred in the first place, and then replace it with a counterexample and try to think and act accordingly. The last one here is focusing on decoupling. So since you're not always, we said this is so innate and unconscious, you're not always able to scrub your brain of these implicit biases. So another solution is to break the causal link between bias and behavior. If we know our brains are imperfect, then we need to set up procedures and structures that check against these predictable failures. So this is more on the end of institutional reforms that function notwithstanding human error. So an example of this, and probably most commonly used, is creating a job description that is explicitly on merit-based criteria before evaluating any candidates for it. Another is structured interviews, or diversifying the team that makes hiring decisions so that one person's in-group bias will counter another. And then outside of that, some like Greenhouse or another like modern applicant tracking system have even taken some of this on their own. And they give you options to remove names and identifying information and incoming resumes. So you might even have some tools accessible to you within your ATS as well. Great. So another way to actively combat unconscious bias and strengthen inclusive hiring practices is to proactively work on diversifying your candidate pipeline. So during COVID and working from home for over the past year, I've had the opportunity to join a lot of webinars. And I found that a topic that kept coming up was diversity recruiting. And what I noticed in the questions and comments that were being made is that there seemed to be a lot of myths that surrounded diversity recruiting efforts. And so to kick things off, I wanted to kind of debunk a few of the common myths that came up across those presentations. And so that's what I have for you here. So you'll see here, the first one, diversity recruiting is just learning how to do a Boolean search. So in fact, diversity recruiting is about understanding concepts of DEI in the context of recruiting, knowing what language to use in the job descriptions and outreach, leveraging employee branding, recognizing explicit and implicit bias, and setting specific goals and metrics. So LinkedIn and Indeed, Glassdoor, they're definitely sold as a one-size-fits-all. But in reality, they don't inherently help support diversity hiring strategies, and the Boolean search is just not going to cut it. Diversity recruiting requires more targeted strategies using resources that are specifically for women, LGBTQ+, Latinx, and other minority communities. For example, women have a 50% chance of finding a job on LinkedIn compared to men, and 40% of women said they found roles through their personal network. And this was through a survey that Fairy Godboss put out just last year. The second one here is that candidates are well aware that job descriptions are wish lists and are able to select appropriate opportunities easily. So in the fact here, I thought it was really fascinating that Zurich Insurance Group, by only adding 6 words to a job listing, they saw the women's share of applications go up 20% for senior level roles. And all they had to change was changing to gender neutral language and noting a flexible work policy. So sorry to any hiring managers tuning in now, but recruiters know that job descriptions can be wish lists to some extent or have extras on there, but job seekers are not always on the same page. So again, by using gender neutral positive language, it's really key, as well as helping hiring managers nail down the specific qualifications that they are targeting during your initial meetings and intake calls. Moving on, a few more here. The myth is that meeting diversity quotas is all it takes to create an equitable hiring practice. So actually, a Harvard Business Review study showed that if you only have one woman in your candidate pool, there's statistically no chance that she'll be hired. So the first step is really to understanding that starting line. So you need to take the time to find out where there is underrepresentation and what full representation looks like, and the timeline the company is pursuing, and then set specific goals and metrics around that. It also needs to be normalized to say exactly what you mean. We have to get really comfortable with the words we use when conversing about race, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, disability, and use these words when we're talking about increasing diversity. For example, rather than saying, we need to increase diversity, say we need to increase representation among Black men in leadership roles in engineering. The specificity is really key in diversity recruiting when you're setting these specific goals. So not to say it is tough when recruiting is so measured by cost per hire and time to fill. If you have to slow down the hiring process to provide an appropriate candidate pool, it can go against the goals of the recruiter, the talent acquisition team. Hiring teams are often concerned by adding on an initiative like this to increase diversity, and the candidate pools will slow down the process. But if you understand where the underrepresentation is occurring, and you're really working towards always having robust pipelines across focus areas, and if you know the work needed up front to source and partner and recruit, then it should not slow down the process. On to the next one here. So candidates don't really care about diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's just not the case. Women are actually 1.5 times more likely to make a decision during the job search based on employer stance on gender and racial equity. And Black women were specifically 2 times as likely. Minority candidates are more likely to evaluate jobs on different criteria. That could be ERG groups that your organization offers, diversity statistics and facts that you have publicly accessible, noting that you have flexible work schedule, just being able to provide insight into your organization's internal programs can go a really long way there. And then this last one we have here, hiring diversity recruiter fixes all diversity related hiring issues. So a diversity recruiter has the specific goal of building robust candidate pools with a focus on identifying and connecting with candidates from marginalized and underrepresented groups. But their role is more related to the hiring system and workforce planning to support talent acquisition teams in sourcing and recruiting top talent, and thus to, like I said earlier, speed up the hiring process. So diversity recruiting goes much further to make sure that all recruiters and hiring managers are equipped with these necessary tools to make an equitable hiring experience. So overall, diversity recruiting increases representation where there's been historical underrepresentation in the workplace. And for some employers, diversity recruiting may mean increasing representation in your candidate pool among men. For some organization, it may mean veterans. For others, it may specifically mean Black women in leadership roles. Increased diversity in every company looks different. So the diversity recruitment strategies must mirror those initiatives. So recruiters' goal is following inclusive hiring practices is to fill the candidate pool in a way that is representative of those who are available in the workforce. To sum it all up, diversity recruiting does not take from anyone. It allows space for many who have been historically untapped. Great. So now that we're equipped with the facts around diversity recruiting, I'm going to talk to you about how we can go about diversifying our pipelines. But actually, before we jump into that, this is that little task I had mentioned earlier. So if you have a piece of paper, feel free to grab that and a pen. And just to be clear, this is a casual exercise. It's for you and only your eyes, won't be shared. So jot it down and just think through it while you're working on this chart. And I'm going to keep chatting about kind of how this is related to inclusive hiring. But if you will, take your piece of paper, turn it long ways, like hot dog style, as they used to say, and you'll want to make a column and do 5 to 10 people in your life that you trust the most. And ideally, it's not family or anyone you're related to. You can just put their initials. And then after you've thought through that, done that, you want to create these other columns with education, age, gender. You can see it all there on the screen, and fill in the blanks. I'll give you a second to get started, but I actually did this exercise as a part of the DEI training that I am currently going through, and I found it to be pretty eye-opening. Again, not asking for anyone to share their results, but I know when I did this, I was a bit shocked at how homogenous my close personal circle is. And the way that this relates to inclusive hiring is through the idea that there is this, what they say is hidden job market. So if you look at JobBite's 2019 Job Seeker Nation survey, they surveyed about 1,500 American job seekers. And the report showed that nearly half of the respondents hear about jobs by word of mouth via friends, and 35% say they also learn about opportunities through professional networks. So in other words, the majority of individuals who got a job or heard about a new opportunity, it was because they were connected to someone in their network that was able to introduce them to the right person at the organization that had said job opening. So something that I've taken on post doing this exercise is finding time to connect with folks outside of just my inner circle, and build a lot stronger relationships there. I've done this by finding kind of similarities in like the rhythm of my normal life and folks who would be kind of naturally inclined to join things I'm already doing, or that I would be inclined to join that they're doing. And that could be even just setting up a coffee date, or a virtual Zoom session catch up. I studied abroad like years ago, haven't talked to so many of those folks in years. And after doing this activity, took it upon myself to start reaching out to those folks, reconnect those relationships, and it's really diversified my personal network. Other ways to do this is to join groups like meetups, alumni groups, religious organizations, anything that meets regularly and kind of forces these relationships that you might not otherwise put the time in for. I've found, and what we kind of talked about in my training session as well, is that you really have to get in the way of other people to grow your personal network. So hopefully everyone's had the time to fill this out, and even after this, take a look at it again and be sure to reflect on that. So outside of that, how can we diversify our candidate pipelines? We were just talking about it, but first on the list is harnessing your network. So like I said, most jobs are found through network. So increasing diversity in your personal network across the board can help others gain access to that hidden job board of personal networks. So reaching out to your network, not being afraid to state that you're always looking to diversify your network, connect with candidates from all walks of life and backgrounds, make your network think and make them help themselves by helping you. And then next on the list is to go where they are. So look at which groups are overrepresented in your pipeline, and the general resources that you use to build said pipeline, and then go to a resource that is overrepresented by the demographic you're looking to increase. Underrepresented groups are creating their own networks. So find them and tap into them. It only took me like a quick Google search to find endless job board options, including the collection at this link, which you all will have access to once we send this out afterward. So definitely take the time to look through that and see if any of them might be useful in your efforts. And the next here on the list, we have let it be known that your organization is committed to equitable and inclusive hiring practices, and that you are aware, educated, and dedicated towards working towards diversity, equity, and inclusion goals. State your commitment to building a diverse and inclusive culture in your job ads, in website job posts. Honestly, like one simple sentence can make a strong impact and send a strong message to all applicants. Unless we have the call people in and not out. So while it's not directly related to building your pipeline, I do think it's an important component in that, like, guaranteeing that your pipeline is actually seen. So recruiters can diversify their candidate pool successfully, but we are not necessarily the decision makers on that next step. And there are circumstances that only we can see. And if we don't lean into those, then no one else is going to have the opportunity to see it and thus fix it. So recruiters, and I think this applies to both agency and internal, are caught in this space of being easy to do business with, right? Because it's so focused on customer and or hiring manager satisfaction. That's great. But we need to find a way to be easy to work with and also stand up to potential bias. And one tactic here is to call in instead of calling out. So calling out might sound like, I noticed that of the last 7 folks who interviewed, only 2 moved forward, both white men, and the 5 you passed on are all from various diverse backgrounds. Calling in is assuming positive intent and asking questions to guide your understanding of the situation. So I noticed only 2 of the 7 interviewed candidates are moving forward. Did you see any similarities in the candidates moving forward and or the profiles you passed on that might help us as we identify additional candidates? Or would you mind taking a few minutes to walk through your decision-making process with me? It's important to note this can also apply to internal efforts. I would never say, hey, Serena, you submitted a really homogenous group of candidates for this search. But instead, I might remind the team in our catch-up call that said client is looking to increase representation on their team and ask if anyone has been able to post on non-LinkedIn, Indeed, Glassdoor job boards yet instead. I do think it is important to recognize that there are times that calling out is the right move. And so, especially in regard to blatant discrimination. So being clued into that and being able to use your EQ and assess the situation and do what feels most appropriate kind of with the information you have at hand. Great. So one super actionable, very easy way to dive right into diversifying your pipeline, quick and easy, is I found that we can use a resource that we already spend so much time on, or at least we at Clarity do, and that's LinkedIn. So I would encourage everyone after this session wraps up to start a search within LinkedIn groups and join 3 to 5 groups that speak to you, that where you'll be able to post and or just reach out to other members who are already in the group. There are over 1 million groups on LinkedIn, and in just maybe a 5-minute search, I was able to find these groups listed here, and all of these had over 1,000 members already in the groups. So it's a great and immediate resource. Awesome. So one thing to remember kind of throughout all of this, and we've hinted on it throughout the presentation, but it's that intent is so important, and recognizing the difference between tokenism and representation is really crucial. So first, yay, more definitions. What are these? So tokenism, you've probably heard this word thrown around, particularly in the DEI world. Do you actually know what it means? And the answer is it depends on the context, because again, it really boils down to intent. In one article written by the business school at Vanderbilt, said tokenism is the practice of doing something, such as hiring a person who belongs to a minority group, only to prevent criticism and give the appearance that people are treated fairly. So what's the difference then between tokenism and representation? Tokenism and representation are often confused with one another and used incorrectly in that way. But again, it all goes back to the difference between the two is that intent. Are you putting a candidate forward because you are wanting to make sure the pool appears diverse? Are you afraid of your candidate pipeline appearing too white, too male, too female dominated? Or is it because you value different perspectives and you're generally trying to diversify even beyond the visible? Are you wanting to give others opportunities that they may not otherwise have a chance to participate in? So what can I do, right? To be sure you do not tokenize someone or a group of persons, the intent is what it boils down to. So sure, this is often hard to grasp and we'll never truly know a person or organization's true intent. So it's important to just constantly question and evaluate the why behind these decisions. So this calls back to the tools that help alleviate unconscious bias, such as adjusting your mindset, debiasing, using decoupling tools, just to help yourself make sure your intent is on the right track. I think it also speaks to the need to normalize vulnerability. Many recruiters and hiring teams are entering real and unfiltered conversations about underrepresentation and increasing diversity for the first time. And when learning something new, the ability to be vulnerable and say, I need help, or I don't feel comfortable talking about this, or I'm scared to say the wrong thing is really critical in receiving support. So if you happen to be leading these efforts to increase diversity or on these teams, work to normalize creating a space where employees feel comfortable saying they need help. As a matter of fact, assume everyone on your team could use more training and support as they are learning the actions that they must start doing in order to increase diversity. Awesome. So yeah, a big piece of the Clarity commitment, as well as our kind of overall values of clarity, humanity, and purpose, which we will talk about shortly, actually, revolve around allyship. So allyship really works like a time card. Every day you clock in and you are working to fulfill your assigned duties as an ally. You clock out when you go to bed and you wake up and do it all again. So in that sense, allyship really is a verb. Ally is not a title that someone gives themselves. It is the embodiment of equity in the form of action. And so we have some key principles of allyship. An ally consistently promotes and embodies inclusive leadership and equitable behaviors and practices. An ally understands the necessity of moving beyond diversity initiatives towards human equity. And an ally passionately and actively engages their own communities and continuously works to dismantle oppressive structures. So in that sense, allyship is a cycle that, it starts with being personally motivated, which we talked about earlier, and then going on to embrace that discomfort and find that vulnerability, being able to then notice inequity, amplify the conversation, and then speak up and act out to make a difference. And then you go right back through it to being personally motivated, embracing the discomfort, and so on and so on. So, great. So why are we doing this? As I just mentioned, at Clarity, our values system has always been very critical to our own success. And these three words are really what inform our work. Clarity, course, obviously, and then humanity and purpose. So in the same way that our values begin in our own walls and kind of permeate all that we do and in each relationship that we form here, we also put forward a separate Clarity commitment last year. I have that for you to look through here. And that's where we commit to our mission of building better teams through implementing the following or the listed pillars of action to kind of supplement our values system at all stages of our work moving forward. And so these efforts to better understand the topics associated with diversity, equity, and inclusion, and our role in the system as both recruiters, but also just individuals, is key to our mission and helps us to be better allies, better humans, and of course, better recruiters. Perfect. So this is actually all the structured content I've got for you at this time. Thanks again so much for joining. And just as a reminder, please get on LinkedIn after this ends if you're not on there already, and go ahead and check out those groups, join a couple and see how you can kind of actively start diversifying your outreach and your candidate pools today. I believe Serena is going to end the recording shortly, as we do have a couple of discussion questions that we would love to kind of hear your input and hear more about the work that your teams are doing and your organizations are doing to promote DEI initiatives. So I will jump to that slide, and then I think Serena will let us know when it's not recording.